Hi and welcome everyone. We're really excited, Michael and I, to talk about air quality today with all of you. I'll start with introducing myself, and then Michael, if you'd like to introduce yourself, we can get started. So my name is Ankita Chachra. I'm the Knowledge for Policy Director at Bernard van Leer Foundation. And our foundation's mission is to ensure that all babies get a good start in life. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But before that, Michael, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Michael Heimbinder, and I'm the founder and executive director of HabitatMap. HabitatMap is based in Brooklyn, New York, but we do work all around the world. And the primary thing we do is we build technology to support grassroots environmental organizing. And primarily what we're directed at now is doing air quality monitoring with schools and community-based organizations.
Great, thanks, Michael. So let's get started with our session today. And I'm going to share my screen to walk you through a little bit of the work that we do and some air quality monitoring and facts about air quality in young kids. So to start with, as I mentioned, Bernard van Leer Foundation focuses on young children. And for us, it's really important that we focus on the most vulnerable. And we believe that, every child should reach its true potential, and that's why that good start in life. And one of the reasons that we've been focused on early years is, of course, there's the science behind how the first 5 years of a child's life are extremely important. The number of connections in their brains, the kind of development that happens, and the experiences they have really shape their lifelong experiences, and also their the way they act as they grow as adults. And the truth is that even now, there are about 250 million children under 5 that don't receive the care that they need in order to achieve their full potential. So that is the reason that we focus on early years. And often people ask, like, what is it that babies really need? And children really need, the first and the foremost is, of course, nurturing and loving caregivers who can make sure that they have food, clothes, all the basics. And then they need nurturing and healthy environments. And this is where our topic of air quality comes into play, because if you really look around the world, the reality is far from having healthy environments. Air quality is a huge factor in how how children experience public spaces and cities around them. To this extent that if you really look at the numbers, about 90% of children live in air that's unclean, which means that if you look at babies itself, that's about 17 million babies that are living in pollution levels that are higher than 6% of international safety guidelines. So here I want to take a break and say, why does it matter so much? Why we're talking about babies and why specifically them and their relationship with air pollution. So I wanted to do a quick exercise with all of you. So we're going to take a quick breathing exercise here. I'm going to share a short video to walk us through this exercise. All right. So I have the video here, and what I'm going to ask all of you to do is just bring back your attention to breathing. Just breathe and just bring your attention to breathing. And as you're bringing your attention to your breath, just inhale, exhale like you normally do. And inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Now let's try and double this up. So inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. And now let's double it up even further. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. That's the speed at what children breathe. So they're actually breathing 4 times faster than what adults breathe, which means that they're also absorbing almost 2 to 3 times more pollutants as they breathe. And this is a really important fact when you really start to consider children and the impact on their lungs as they're growing and as their bodies are developing. There's a lot of research that also shows, I'm going to go back to my presentation, there's also a lot of research that shows that the impact that children have, the impact of air pollution actually has detrimental effects on their cognitive, emotional, and physical development. And I'm sure Michael can talk a little bit more about that later. So the problem's huge, which brings us to the question of what can we really do about it. And for us at the foundation, what's been really interesting is to start with understanding air pollution itself and understanding how do we start to measure and monitor it, understand what's around us. So I'll walk everyone through just a quick refresher and like a 101 on air pollution. So when we talk about air pollution, the word itself, we're generally talking about four kind of things. We're talking about nitrogen dioxide. We're talking about ground level ozone. We're talking about particulate matter, which is like these small particles in the air. And of course, we're talking about volatile organic compounds. This is available, like this exists in some of the packaging that we have, and like there are a lot of pieces out there that you can research more on that. But mostly when we talk about it, these are the four components that we're talking about. And often you'll see in the news, there's conversations around the PM levels, the particulate matter levels. And while these numbers may sound like, what does that mean? What is PM10, PM2.5, PM0.1? The fact is that each of the size of this particle has a different impact on our body. So as you can see from this diagram, a finer particle would actually get into like our bloodstreams and can actually get into further in our systems, whereas like other particles affect maybe just the nasal or the lung. While we can't always have healthy air and you can't always, there's always going to be some exposure, WHO does set guidelines on what is acceptable and how much exposure can humans have in a healthy environment. So that gives us an idea of what air quality is. And I know Michael will talk more about the PM matter. But that brings us to the next question. How do you start to really measure air quality? How do you really start to understand a combination of all these particles, of all these components within the air? And that's where air quality index comes in. It's an index that allows us to see air quality in a single value. And of course, higher the AQI value, that's greater the level of pollution and greater the health concerns for us. What's interesting is, though, that, and I found this recently, is that most AQIs are linked to local laws and regulations. So based on countries and regions that they're developed in, a lot of AQIs are different. So there's a Chinese standard, there's a Canadian standard, there's a US standard. And so there is no global standard of AQI. It really is based on the region. Which means that, when you see an AQI in one country versus the other, you can't compare it. However, there are sites and there are places where they're trying to aggregate that data and put it on a global map. So, websites like IQ Air or the one that we're going to use for an exercise today, Plume Labs, does something very similar. So I'm going to take a pause here and see if there are any questions. And if not, I'm going to encourage all of you to take part in this short exercise around air quality. Let's see if there are questions, and if not, we can move. I don't necessarily see any questions yet. All right, so we're going to move to the next part, which is doing this little exercise on how clean is your air. So like I said, every standard is different. So the purpose of this activity, we're going to use a standard that's developed by Plume Labs. And you can see they start with 0 to 20 and go all the way up to 250. So there's a slightly shorter range. And this tells you how good or bad the air is. So what I'd like to encourage all of you to do is in the chat feature, if you can enter what you think the air quality in your city or place that you're from is. 150 in Istanbul, okay. Actually, Istanbul is not that bad today. It's on a moderate air quality, which is 22. But if you actually look at some of the other cities in the region, you start to see that, as you go up north, even in the city, it starts to change because the local air quality is really different than regional. I also want to look at some other cities in in Turkey. And I think there is Izmir, which is also not bad. It's 22. Then you've got, let's zoom out a little bit more. Let's see Ankara, which is 27. That's moderate. Izmir is 31, so slightly worse than Istanbul, one would say. And then Bursa, which is 25. So again, today seems like a day that Turkey is doing well. But these change, and I would really encourage you to check them out on a daily basis. And I do that every day to know what's the air quality. This can be impacted by various things, whether it's just local weather conditions or, increase in transportation or different industry, different seasons, different times of the day. So I'll stop here. And with that encouragement of monitoring air quality data, I'd like to invite Michael to share how he does that in his work and this little device that he has that's able to, there's a question of Zonguldak. Okay, let's see where that is. My geography of Istanbul of Turkey is not that good, but let's see if we can find that. Let's see. I don't find that, but maybe I'm going to share the map in the chat, and Salim, you could. Oh, there it is in the north. That's interesting. So you have Alapi that is slightly worse, and then Karadizin, which is also higher. But it seems like this the one that you mentioned is not that bad. But it's always interesting to me to see these differences even within the same region. With that, Michael, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite you to share insights with the audience.
Thanks, Ankita. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk about the aircasting platform. Let's see. All right. So the aircasting platform is a series of different technologies. One is the AirBeam air quality monitor, which looks like this. This is the AirBeam 2. It measures fine particulate matter, or PM2.5, PM1, and PM10, which are some of the size fractions that Ankita was talking about earlier. And what it does is it communicates those in real time to an Android application running on Android smartphones, and it's called aircasting. And so what happens is that the AirBeam, through its intake, will take a tiny sample of air. And when it pulls that sample of air in, this is a diagram of what the sensor looks like. It's going to pull the air in, and then a laser is going to scatter off the particles. And when it scatters off those particles, that light scatter is registered by a detector, and then a mass-based measurement is estimated. And so based on how the light is scattering off these particles, you're going to get a different measurement, and based on how many particles are in the air and what size and shape they are and what color. And so this is the sensor that's inside the AirBeam that's making that measurement. And so every second when you're walking along with the AirBeam, it's going to be basically taking a measurement, and it's also going to be taking a measurement of temperature and humidity, and sending that to the aircasting application. And so you'll be walking along with your phone, and you'll be able to see those measurements, those air quality measurements, mapped every second. And what you'll find is that they'll frequently change very quickly based on what's happening in your immediate environment. So you pass a smoker, you're going to see the measurements go up. You pass a diesel vehicle with diesel exhaust coming out, you're going to see that inside the monitor, and you're going to see it mapped on the map. And so it's very sensitive, and it's very much responsive to what's happening immediately in your environment. If there are no sources, then when you're walking around, you'll generally find that the air quality is relatively similar. But in a place like Istanbul, you're going to see there's lots of variation. We were looking at kind of sizes before, and Ankita was talking about the different sizes of particles that are out there. I thought this was an interesting visualization that shows you here coronavirus, 0.1 to 0.5 microns in diameter. So very, very tiny. And for reference, they show you a human hair is 50 to 180 microns in diameter. And the particles that we're talking about here are the ones that are less than 10 microns in diameter. So right here is dust particle. It's a little bit bigger than a red blood cell, but you can see that the particles that we're talking about go all the way down to this smallest size. And as Ankita mentioned, the smaller the particles, the more likely they are to penetrate deep into your body and impact multiple organ systems. And you also have to consider the toxicity of the particle. So a particle of black carbon from diesel exhaust is going to be much more hazardous than a particle that's coming from the waves crashing at the beach, which are going to be non-hazardous. The AirBeam cannot discern between a particle of salt floating in the air when you're at the beach and a particle of black carbon floating in the air when you're in the city center. But for the most part, when you're out there measuring, if you see a rise in the measurements, it's because you have some sort of hazardous particle source nearby you. So let's switch over to the Aircasting app and what it looks like when you're gathering your data. Well, let's look at the phone app first. So you're going to be doing the AirBeam Swap, and when you do that, you'll get an AirBeam. You may get an Android device. You may be using your own. We'll be releasing an Apple app later this month at the end of October. So you can look forward to that if you have an iOS phone. And so you get to start off, and when you start, you determine whether you're going to be walking with the AirBeam or whether you're going to set it up in a fixed location. For the AirBeam Swap, I think you're mostly going to be walking, but I wanted to let you know that the AirBeam also can take measurements from a fixed location. And so you can either walk around and get measurements every second, or you could set the AirBeam up in your office or hang it outside your window or create an entire network of AirBeams in a neighborhood, and those will communicate to the Aircasting server and update measurements every minute. And they could do that either via the cellular network, the mobile phone network, or via Wi-Fi. So you begin by choosing, will you be walking, will you be mobile, or will you be fixed? And from there, I'm going to talk about recording a mobile session, and you'll get details on this. You don't need to worry about the step-by-step process. It's also laid out by the app. This is what the visualization looks like when you're looking at kind of a chart. It's going to show you minute by minute what your averages are. And then you can kind of dig down in, and then you can see the graph. Here I'm measuring temperature is what's shown on the graph here, but you can switch between the parameters just by tapping them. And when you do, you'll see detail. You can zoom in on the graph, kind of see how they're varying over time. And then you also have a map visualization. The map visualization is slightly different between the app and the website. On the app, you're going to see it as colored blocks. And so each of these colored blocks corresponds to the average of all the measurements that have been taken in this area. And the blue line is your route. And so you can see along this route, I'm in Manhattan, going over the Manhattan Bridge. It's a little bit faint here, but it's green and yellow, and it's a little more yellow on the bridge where I'm cycling right next to traffic. And then we'll go ahead and switch over and see what it looks like on the web. So here's a session that somebody recorded where they're walking. They did an enormously long session. They started walking at 5 in the morning and didn't stop moving around with the AirBeam until 6:30 or 18:37. So they were out a long time. And when you measure for a longer period of time, the app will average your measurements after a certain period of time. And so what you can see is this person, they were definitely, I can tell what mode of transport they were taking because I can see how quickly they're moving. When I hover over the graph, I can see where the measurement was on the graph, how high it was and what time it was. And then I can see the blue dot on the map, which corresponds to the location where those measurements were taken. And so this person was essentially moving all around Brooklyn, going along the waterfront, and you can see the variation in their measurements as they walked along. Online, again, the measurements are shown as dots, whereas inside the app, they're shown as squares. Let me see if I can get this. And then I wanted to show you one of the nice things about the Aircasting website is that, one, you take the measurements, you see it on the app, and then when you're done, it immediately all flows into the website where you can kind of review the different types of data you've collected. You can look at what other people have collected all around the world. We have lots of data for New York City, so I'm showing you New York now. So what's showing here is that there's 122 sessions that were recorded in the last year in this region that we're looking at now. And if I turn on something called the crowd map, which is an option here on the lower left, it's going to take a minute to load. But what it's going to do is it's going to take all 122 of those sessions that were recorded over the course of the year, and then it's going to display them as colored blocks on a map. And those colored blocks correspond to the averages again. So I can see there's a deeper orange here. I'm going to click on that, and it's going to give data for that location. So in this location, defined by this grid cell that's orange, which corresponds to a measurement of between 35 micrograms per cubic meter and 55, and we know that the actual average was 51 micrograms. There were 12,746 one-second measurements, and there was one person contributing those measurements. And so you can, what'll be great is that when you do the AirBeam swap, even if you're not coordinating with people in the place where you're at, you can see their measurements on the map, and you can combine their measurements with your measurements using this crowd map visualization, which is a great way to see whether some parts some parts of the city were hotspots where there was higher particulate matter measurements, and some parts of the city might be cool spots where there were lower measurements. One thing to keep in mind is that it can vary a lot from day to day. So on the course of your day, maybe when you went past the bus depot, the measurements were highest. And another day, you go by and they're also highest, but the overall background concentration is lower. So when you're comparing measurements from day to day, you have to take that into account, that the background measurement might be very different. But when you encounter those sources, they're always going to spike up from that background level. So for context, about half the particulate matter in New York City comes from outside the region. And this is true in many cities where most of the exposures you're seeing for particulate matter are coming from local sources, diesel-powered buses and trucks, charbroiling restaurants and food stands. If you have a heat that burns biomass or oil heat, you'll see those show up in your local particulate matter concentrations. But you'll also see stuff blowing in from outside, forest fires coming from that are burning in another country, for instance, or factory pollution blowing in from Poland. So you'll see this type of stuff, and some of it will be coming from your local sources, and some of it will be coming from outside the region. And so that's something that's important to keep in mind. Let's see next. So I want to talk a bit about how people are using the aircasting platform. So I'm really excited about the AirBeam Swap because I think some of these are it's a very innovative way to use the aircasting platform. It builds community. It also allows you to collect data to inform decision-making. And so I wanted to show a couple of examples. One is AirBeam, which is a French nonprofit that does air quality regulations and public outreach in Paris. And what AirBeam has been doing for several years now is using the AirBeam with young people and with adults they'll check out an AirBeam, they'll check out an Android device, and they'll go about their daily routine, and they'll look at what the exposures were, look at what type of exposures they had to particulate matter. Sometimes they'll even do things where one person will walk, one person will take the bus, another person will take the metro, and then they'll compare their exposures across transit systems. Or ways of getting around the city. And so there's a lot of innovative ways you can use the aircasting platform and the AirBeam to kind of answer whatever question you have, whether it be, is this facility contributing to pollution in the neighborhood? If we take different modes of transit, can we reduce our exposures? If we take different walking routes, can we reduce our exposures? So people are using the AirBeam all around the world to answer different questions about air quality. Here's another example from the New York Times. So the New York Times took AirBeams and they shared them, or they handed them to two different young people in India, in New Delhi. And what they found was that the young man who was from a lower income family had dramatically higher exposures over the course of a day versus the young woman who was from a wealthier family. The low-income family that young man went to a school that was open air, so it didn't have a HVAC system or heating, ventilation, air conditioning system that removed particles from the air. They didn't have air filters. He didn't have an air filter in his room, whereas the young woman did. So it basically traced them over the course of their day and showed, very different exposures. And this is something you can do. So this is when they're waking up. The young man's exposure is 160 micrograms per cubic meter, the young woman 26.8. Obviously, they live in very different homes. And so all throughout the day, they were carrying around these AirBeams, and you could track their exposures as they commuted, as they got ready in the morning, once they were at school, when they came home and their family was cooking at night. And so essentially, they're showing you, in this case, is the young woman. She's the yellow line. You can see it's much lower than the young man's line, which is, at the end of the day, 4 or 5 times higher. So this is another great example of how the AirBeam and the aircasting platform could be used to collect data, but also, in this instance, raise the awareness around this particular issue. Disparate impacts from air pollution exposures that around the world, no matter where you are, politically and socially marginalized people who are low income, are usually the ones who bear the brunt of exposure to air pollution. 2 young people living in the same city, potentially breathing the same air, are in fact breathing entirely different air because of the way they have access to indoor spaces that have filtration and at home and at school primarily. I want to show you a short video of another example of how people are using the aircasting platform. This is a group called El Puente, and they're based in Williamsburg in the South Side, a neighborhood called the South Side Williamsburg. And I'll just let the video speak for itself.
Everybody wants to breathe clean air. Everybody wants the opportunity to breathe clean air. Unfortunately, all around the world, in cities, people are facing unprecedented air quality problems. 100,000 cars travel over the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway every day. And it's not just cars, it's trucks and buses, and those are diesel powered. And so you have a lot of particulate emissions that are coming from these types of things. People in the community were saying, I have health problems, my family has health problems, my dog has health problems, and they believed that it was related to things that were happening in the environment.
This community has struggled for decades, if not a whole century, with bad air quality. It's something that people didn't really think much about, and they didn't connect their incidences of asthma and respiratory disease to air quality, but they do now.
If you wanted to go measure air quality, the instruments that are run by the state are $15,000, $20,000. And so we said, how can we solve this problem? How can we bring down the cost? How can we make it easier to use? And that's what aircasting was developed to address, to empower communities to be able to document the environmental hazards in their neighborhood, share it with a bigger audience, and make for policy change. The way aircasting works is there's an AirBeam, which measures tiny particles floating in the air, and it connects to a smartphone app. From there, you get real-time feedback about what the air quality is like. If we're talking about bad air, there's lots of different types of pollutants, and we're measuring one of those pollutants. Fine particulate matter, also known as PM 2.5, they can get straight into our lungs and pass through into our bloodstream. Short term, it can lead to asthma and bronchitis. Long term, it can create problems like cancer and heart disease.
The AirBeam technology has allowed us to really understand the severity of a situation in this neighborhood and to actually, put a number to it, which is really helpful in creating policy around air quality.
To me, the future of clean air is about community innovation. It's about communities becoming empowered, using all the tools at their disposal, including high-tech solutions. But it's not just about the technology. It's about the technology in the hands of communities.
So I'll stop there. I just wanted to be able to kind of share all the different ways that people are using the aircasting platform. One thing I forgot to mention is that inside the aircasting platform, you can also go and view fixed data. Previously, Ankita was showing data from Plume Labs. And so you can frequently go on and find different platforms that'll show you fixed data. In aircasting, it's under the fixed tab, and it's taken from a website called OpenAQ that aggregates data from government monitoring stations. When I go to Turkey, it in fact does not show me any data, even though it shows me data for neighboring countries. I'm not sure why that is, whether it's that there's something wrong with the way that the data is being pulled from Turkey, or perhaps Turkey doesn't share their data. But that's one of the challenges. So here's another website, IQ Air, and I can click on one of their stations here, and I'm not sure where that data is coming from, because it says it's coming from the, I'm not sure. So perhaps these are stations that are run by the Turkish government. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that sometimes when you're looking at data online, it's an estimate, and other times it's actually a real-time measurement coming from usually a government or a state that's set up a station and is reporting the data. So it is important to try to get to the source of the data and find out what instrument is reporting that data and who it's being run by. But yeah, I'll just close with say that I think the AirBeam Swap, one of the things that's really exciting about it is that it does exactly this, which is put the technology in the hands of people. And that's what this whole project is about. And that's what the AirBeam Swap is about too, is that previously only governments and scientists and academics were measuring air quality because the instruments were so expensive. But now with low air quality, you can't measure every air quality pollutant with a low-cost sensor. But in the case of particulate matter, the low-cost sensors are quite good. The AirBeam is good, but there are many other PM instruments out there that are also low-cost that are good that people are using to make measurements and make change. And so this is a process of democratizing science and giving people an opportunity to take measurements. And oftentimes you'll find that, I find at least when working with community organizations, it's not that they weren't aware that there was a pollution problem in their neighborhood. Normally, they're intimately aware. Their children can't make it to school because they're having an asthma attack. They can see the pollution in the air some of the times, but they don't have the evidence to basically support their anecdotal claims. And so the ability to go out and take air quality measurements with a low-cost device can be part of the process of collecting that evidence, but also raising awareness in the community and hopefully getting media attention for it too. Because we know that those are also important things to push our elected officials and our government officials and our air quality regulators to do right by communities and regulate sources the way they should be and protect communities from air pollution. So I'll stop there.
I actually have a question, Michael, because when you were showing some of the data for the air casting on the map, it seems that you can actually adjust, you can also adjust the range of what is considered moderate and what is considered harmful. Is that correct?
That's right. So I'm glad you asked that question. So let me share my screen real quick. Back to here. And this is one of the things I think is important, not only because, like you said, the air quality indexes differ from country to country, but also because from a visual data visualization standpoint, it's oftentimes, so let me try to find a good session here. It's oftentimes difficult to see what the difference is when you're looking at a map of measurements. So let me try to look at this one. And so you go out and you take measurements. Here's a perfect example. So here's somebody who took measurements. They're walking around a public park in Brooklyn. And for the most part, there was very little variation. And you know, that's an honest portrait of what it was. They were walking around in the park. There probably weren't a lot of sources inside the park. But one of the neat things you can do on air casting is you can change the relationship between measurements and colors. And here I'll just do a fit to scale feature that we have, which is this connected arrow down here in the right corner. There it goes. And so what it does in this instance is it's taking a little while to load. I'm not sure why. Oh, wait. bring it back to that. Well, when it loads, you'll see that what previously was a session that was just showing you green and red is now showing you kind of a greater variation. And so this session isn't actually that great of an example because the measurements were so tightly clustered together. But one of the nice things about changing the relationship between measurements and colors is you can kind of bring out these contrasts. And so you can find the relatively cleaner or relatively dirtier air along your route.
Yeah, and then with the WHO guidance on 10 what is it, micrograms, or how do you say MU?
Yeah, micrograms per cubic meter. And in fact, WHO just updated their guidelines. And so, the countries have regulations, WHO has guidelines, right? And so their guideline is now for 24-hour standard. They're saying you shouldn't be exposed to more than 5 micrograms per cubic meter. Or no, I think it's 15 micrograms per cubic meter over the course of a day.
Yeah.
And then the new annual standard is 5 micrograms per cubic meter. And just so for reference, in the United States, I'm not sure what they are in Turkey. In the United States, the 24-hour standard is 35. And the WHO standard is 15 now. So less than half is what the WHO guideline says. And for the 24-hour standard, it's 5 rather than 12, again, less than half. And so what we see from that is that because there's not a correspondence between health guidelines or regulations between countries, you could probably trust the fact that the more conservative the estimate is, the better and more protective it is going to be for your health, right? Because regulations are frequently put in place not strictly based on health, but based on the political realities of the industries in that country and how they interact with government. And so for the smallest particles, like ultrafine particles coming from diesel exhaust, there's no safe level of exposure. There's never safe to breathe in diesel exhaust, whether it's 1 microgram or 12 micrograms or 30 micrograms. And so the health-based guidelines are just that. They're guidelines, but in fact, anytime you can reduce exposures to particulate matter, you will improve health. You will reduce hospitalizations, you will reduce emergency department visits, you will reduce chronic disease incidences. And so it's really important to bring this down to zero and not just settle for whatever the guideline happens to be in your country. That we really need to remove all sources of air pollution, especially for people who are most vulnerable.
Great. And I think what's interesting is also in the article from New York Times, right, that they show the disparity, but it's not like the lady from a higher income is also protected because her exposure level was still higher than what is recommended. So I feel that this is one that is no one's safe, but of course we recognize that those that are at a disadvantage are the ones from more vulnerable communities, and then also for children, again, like when you start thinking of how babies are growing and their lungs, the amount of air they're breathing, and the development that they're having, it harms them and impacts them even more than it would adults. And what's really sad is that, what we learned, we had a convening on air quality recently at our foundation, that actually that exposure starts in the placenta. So even pregnant women, as they're carrying kids, they're exposing their kids to air pollution. So it's definitely a big factor for us to consider and to advocate for, and information, as you mentioned, right, that communities being able to collect that data and empowering them is really important. Which brings us to our next part, which is to introduce the AirBeam air quality monitor swap with all of you. And I really do hope that some of you would sign up for this and really be part of this community. So we have a short video for you to give you a little bit of an idea of what this AirBeam swap is all about. And then, of course, we'll share some links where you can sign up and register. So I'm going to quickly bring in a video here. Let's hope this completely works.
Air pollution is a global problem that affects millions of people living in cities. It is a burden that has effects on the health of children and adults. This information is quite worrying, right? Wouldn't you like to know how much pollution there is around your neighborhood? This little ghost, it's an air quality monitor. A very friendly electronic creature that feeds from collecting data on the quality of air. It's able to measure harmful microscopic air particles, humidity, and temperature. Connected with all its friends, they share all the data they collected and put it all together. We at Urban95 have caught some of them and started an experiment. We are going to release these little ghosts all across the globe and create swap chains so they can be hosted by people from all over the place. They get to hang out with you, they get to taste the variety of air in your surroundings, and then, after 3 months, you will pass the air ghost on to the next host. You can place it either indoors or outdoors, or you can use its mobile mode to take it around and discover how much pollution we can find around places frequented by children and elderly people. Using the Aircasting app, you will be able to see all this data and share what you found out with the rest of the community. You'll be able to compare the pollution in your area with the rest of the world's. Just make sure to get all those air particles and pass it on to the next person. With our little ghosts jumping from home to home, we plan to map the pollution of your surroundings compared to others in this swap, to increase awareness on the quality of air we breathe and continue the conversation about the importance of clean air in cities and where should the action be prioritized. So you can come together with other people from the chain to connect and share your experiences. Together, we can calculate the pollution in cities with factual data and connect with each other to spread the word. If you're interested in hosting a little ghost and be part of the chain, send us a message for more information.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to encourage our technical team to please share the link for registration in the chat so all of you can register. And we really do hope that you'll join us in this be part of this community. With that, we'd like to wrap up our session and see if there are any questions that Michael and I can answer. Michael, do you want to take that one?
Sure. To what extent is the psychology of people living in areas with poor air quality affected? Any studies on this? That's a very good question. I don't have a great answer for you, but I'll share what information I do have. One of the things I've always found fascinating is this concept of forest bathing, which I believe is I first encountered it and learned about the topic when looking at Japan, and that people will in fact go into forested areas, go into park spaces as a way of bathing, but it's a kind of metaphorical bathing, right? So you're at the same time you're breathing in cleaner air, you're also surrounded by maybe a bit more quiet than the rest of the city. You're breathing in volatile organic compounds from the trees, maybe having beneficial effects. So this idea that if you're living in a place and you seek out a place to bathe, to forest to bathe, it's a sense that you're taking a break from the pollution and all the things that are come along with that pollution, which is frequently noise. Other types of pollution, like, other types of pollutants. And so I think absolutely people who live in poor air quality are psychologically impacted. One, at the physiological level, they're probably impacted, or they are impacted because they're breathing air that's worse for their health. And that can create problems where it is synergistic. So if you already have a chronic health problem like diabetes or asthma, and then it intersects with poor air quality, then obviously that's going to have a physiological effect, but it's also going to have effect on your psychology. In addition, we know these particles actually impact the brain also, and so they can have neurological effects. And then in addition, if you're in an air quality with poor air in an area that's low income and has poor air quality, it also probably means you have less access to open space, less access to public transportation frequently. And so it's really hard to disentangle all of these things. But on one level, we know that air pollution is bad for you physiologically. In fact, it can impact your brain. And the other side, we know that if you live in a cleaner area, you'll be healthier, and that will also impact your psychology. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on this issue, actually, about the kind of intersection of air quality, psychological health, as well as physiological health, and how they all tie together. But absolutely, I think on a physiological level, there are psychological impacts, and there are obviously psychological impacts that also come from all of the things that come along with air pollution, which usually means a degraded environment and less access to city amenities and resources.
There's another question, Michael, which I think might be more relevant for you. I can read it out. So it says, air quality can change according to immediate conditions. I wonder if there is a section of the app that explains immediate environmental conditions of the person uploading the input.
This is a really great question because context is everything. And so when I look at someone's session online and I see their measurements, I don't know why they're high in one spot and low in another. I can pull in contextual information. So some of that contextual information will come from land use. So before I saw that person's walking in a park, and I can make certain assumptions about that space. Or I could mesh their data with, in the United States, we have something called the National Emissions Inventory. So big polluters, like a petrochemical plant, will have to report into that database. And so I could pull their measurements, and I can overlay national emissions inventory data, and I get contextual information that way. But oftentimes the best information is from the person who's actually taking the measurements. And so inside the Aircasting app, you can make notes, and soon you'll be able to also take photos and attach notes and photos to measurements. And so you'll be able to provide that contextual information. Frequently when we're doing this work with schools and communities, they'll keep a separate written log of what they encountered, and they'll sometimes map sources. So they'll carry a map with them, and they'll note there was construction on this corner. Or when I was taking measurements at this park, there was a food delivery truck that was idling. And so there is a certain part of the app where you can note that. It's also oftentimes important to make those notes separately so you can kind of note sources and then collect that data and use it to kind of interpret your information. And then oftentimes you can get contextual information from online databases regarding sources and land use types.
I think it was also interesting, Michael, when you talked about this last time, that also when people start cooking or if they're smoking indoors, like that also generally shows a spike in the air quality. So there's all, and that's something that you probably can't find out from national data. It's more like you mentioned, more in terms of ambient and outdoor. There's another question. Does AirBeam Swap plan to cooperate with federal and local governments and share the data they have? AirBeam will have data. Will AirBeam have data to make? Yes, AirBeam Swap will have the data, but to make a change, I think there needs to be a cooperation with organizations and governments. Absolutely agree with you, Yusuf, that is the end goal. But for us, this swap is actually the first step for raising awareness within the users and just recognizing, as Michael said, empowering them with the information. And hopefully, if we get enough critical mass and we're able to compare some of the air quality data, at least for the foundation in the cities and the countries that we work with. I think this would be really powerful to make a point of why more investments needed and also to advocate for it. So while the AirBeam Swap doesn't directly connect with some of the government and federal requirements, the idea is that through the data that's collected, we can really make a case and really hope that can start to bring attention and use as a communication tool. I think this one might be for you, Michael, and I can jump into. Any examples of community involvement with the community collected data? Do you know if any city hall municipality has made legislative changes via the community pushback?
Yes, that's a great question. Let me show you some examples of that. So, share my screen again. So here's an example. So this was a study done in conjunction with several different community-based organizations in New York City. In New York City, if you are a residence or a not-for-profit or a government agency, the Department of Sanitation, which is run by New York City, picks up your trash. However, if you're a privately run business, like a restaurant or a cafe, you hire a private company to come pick up your trash. And so this created a real problem in New York City where you had, for instance, this is a diagram showing you, on a single, this is actually from Los Angeles was dealing with something similar. This is from Los Angeles, but you would have a single block where you would have, this shows you 7 different companies making pickups on this block, which means 7 diesel-powered heavy-duty trash trucks coming down the block every day or multiple times a week, one for trash pickup, another for recycling pickup. And so what New York communities wanted them to do was to carve up the city into zones and award exclusive contracts to a carter based on that zone. And so instead of having 7 trucks drive down the street, you'd have 1. And so this was actually successfully passed and implemented in New York City. And one of the reasons why was because we did air quality monitoring. And so what we did is we trained young people from these communities to stand on truck-intensive intersections where there are a lot of trucks coming through, and most of them were waste trucks. And then we measured air quality at the same time. And so all of a sudden we had this very interesting data set that shows this is how many trucks are coming through, and this is what the air quality is like versus the background measurement, versus the measurement coming from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So at this intersection in the South Bronx, we saw that ambient concentrations of PM2.5 were 6 to 8 times higher than the closest DEC monitoring station. And this was at rush hour. And we did this in multiple neighborhoods, you can see. And what we ended up seeing was that there was this very clear relationship between number of trucks and a deterioration of the air quality that helped us build support for a new way of handling solid waste in New York City, which happened to be this franchised or zoned system. One of the things we also found was that we gave air beams to the people who were driving these trucks, and they put them in their truck cab, and we could see how different types of trucks had different pollution levels. So they have different engines. And so in the United States in 2007, they passed regulations that require you to, for instance, to put on diesel particulate filters, which is emissions control technology. And so the first route, you can see, this is a garbage truck driving around New York City, and they started in Brooklyn, and they drove all the way to the northern tip of Manhattan, all over the city, all night long, to come back and dump their waste. So first, they're driving all over the city in these crazy routes that are very inefficient. Second, you see it's mostly red because the concentrations were so high, because this is a pre-2007 truck that's putting out a lot of pollution. And then you see the truck that's post-2007 here, it's still driving all over the city, but the exposures for the people driving the truck and obviously everyone along the route are lower. And so absolutely, communities are using this information to make change and improve policy in cities. That's just one example, but it's happening all around the world.
Yeah, Michael, thanks for sharing that. That's so local and so interesting. I also wanted to share something that's happening in London. And you know, the death of this young girl, Ella, who was the first child who actually on her death records it says that she died because of air pollution. I think that's also led like to a big movement that's happening in the UK and in London specifically. So you can actually see a lot of action that the government's taken has also been from a very consistent and persistent pressure from communities, from those that were advocating for action. So I would say that there's a lot there that you can that the community can do, like that power that the community has to ask their elected officials to take action. I see, and there's one more question. This is probably going to be the last one because we're almost at time. Is there any cooperation with schools within the scope of this project? Is it possible to involve children from disadvantaged areas as I'm not sure if you're referring to AirBeam Swap, but yes, absolutely. The idea with the AirBeam Swap is to really involve the users themselves that get impacted by air quality. So we would definitely encourage, if there's a school, and if you're representing a school or know of a school that would be interested to be part of this program. And of course, in terms of solutions too, you know, we've engaged different communities, and we want to hear from people. So absolutely, when a part of the AirBeam Swap is also going to be for people to come together who are actually collecting the data and talk about both what their observations are and what they observe, but also share some solutions and actions that they can see their cities taking. So it really is a community where we can have the space to discuss what's possible. And then hopefully from the learnings from that, we can share it with the cities and more globally through our platforms. So we really do hope that happens. So thank you for that question, Bursa. So with that, I guess we're almost at time. Michael, if you want to say some last words for wrap up, and then I could go.
Yeah, just quickly, thanks so much for everyone for being here, participating. It's much appreciated. And please do follow up, info@habitatmap.org if I could be of assistance as you get into the AirBeam Swap.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And I echo Michael's sentiment. Thank you so much for joining. And I really do hope that you'll sign up and join us in this movement and really advocate on behalf of young kids and babies to get clean air in your surroundings. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. We can share it with the cities and more globally through our platforms. So we really do hope that happens. So thank you for that question, Bursa.